The Penguins were grounded. After 2 years of existence, the fledgling Pittsburgh Penguins offered home fans little in the way of attraction. They were workmanlike, the roster practically anonymous, interchangeable, and they did not draw. At this time, the face of the franchise was bookish 33-year-old goaltender Les Binkley. What they needed was a center, a puck possessor. Not flash, but stability. They needed an identity. No one could have known at the time that hope would arrive in the form of a third-round pick, an undersized center that almost every team had passed on in the draft twice over. His name was Michel Briere. It wasn't that he couldn't score. 2 years earlier, he put up 159 points for the Shawinigan Bruins Quebec Junior Club. He followed that up with 161 in his draft year. But, at 5'10" and a sprightly 165 pounds, he was considered too small by scouts. They doubted whether his numbers meant anything. Few bothered traveling to Shawinigan to find out. In an era that distrusted small, skilled centers, Michel Briere fit the profile of a player easily overlooked. Pittsburgh took a flyer anyway. When Penn's GM Jack Riley offered a contract, Briere asked for more money. When Riley asked why he thought he deserved it, Briere reasoned that it was because he planned to play in Pittsburgh for the next 20 years. The Penguins invited 15 centers to training camp that summer, but Briere stood out. To a Penguins group inured to generic play, Briere looked different. He generated a quiet buzz around the igloo, the kind only players inside the room can really feel. Center ice had been a problem for Pittsburgh from the start. Their depth chart was built around veterans and bottom six placeholders. Useful players, like Wally Boyer and Billy Harris, but no one who could move the needle, no one who could settle a line or tilt a shift. Penn's coach, Red Kelly, normally restrained in his public comments, broke character. He praised the rookie openly. In that era, almost no one jumped straight from junior to the NHL. But with Pittsburgh's center depth what it was, and with Briere's mix of speed, patience, and smarts, he bucked the trend. When he made the final roster, Kelly planned to send Billy Harris to the AHL. Harris chose to retire instead. That left Briere, 19 years old, as the center Pittsburgh didn't know it had been waiting for. Within the first month of the season, Briere was sharing spot duty on the top line with veteran center Wally Boyer. Coach Kelly trusted him with the heavy responsibility of leading the Pens charge because he seemed mature for his age. On the top line, he helped veteran winger Dean Prentice score his 300th career goal. After the game, in which Briere also scored his first, Prentice and Kelly each forecasted 300 or more for the teenager whose career was just getting started. His on-ice mannerisms, his puck handling, his poise, his patience, spoke of a young man comfortable where he found himself. He displayed soft hands, making him equally adept as both a playmaker and as a sniper, though he would often look for the pass first. He would never be mistaken for Bobby Hull, but in a small sample size, proved himself a quietly efficient facilitator. Within a couple of months, he was being called the darling of the franchise, and those few that watched the team closely knew they had a building block. The results, however, remained elusive. It took the team 31 games to get their 10th win of the season, but as bad as they were at times, they still fared better than they'd been expected to. The season before, it had taken the team 42 tries to hit the 10-win mark. Briere got occasionally hot during the year, but struggled to find his consistency until late in the campaign. Still, his skating and poise remained positive signs for the future. He would get pushed into corners but never outmuscled. At times, he was considered a leading candidate for Calder Trophy. More importantly, curiosity seekers and stragglers began buying tickets, slowly at first. A good-sized crowd for a Penguins game around this time was about 6,000, though that would change before season's end. Here a little and there a little, all signs pointed to a dawning renaissance in Steeltown. As the season came winding down, Briere began to establish himself with 20 points in his final 24 games. The Pens also fought their way to a 9-11-4 record during that same stretch. The Pens finished the year with 26 wins and a .421 winning percentage. Briere finished with 44 points on an anemic offense that had gotten shut out a whopping 14 times to end up third in club scoring. Still, their record was good enough to secure second place in the NHL's expansion clubs only West Division and an invite to their first playoff action. The playoffs opened at the Igloo in front of just 8,051 fans. Their opponents were the Oakland Seals, a team that, on paper, should have been the class of the 1967 expansion, but never found its footing. Ownership instability, front office turnover, and an indifferent market had drained most of the promise out of the roster. They still finished only 6 points behind Pittsburgh, and the matchup was, in effect, a meeting between the league's two lowliest teams. Game 1 reflected it. Nerves, scrambles, and a disputed go-ahead goal in the third period. After Pittsburgh took the lead, Oakland's Carol Vadnais clipped Briere over the head with his stick, prompting Brian Watson to intervene. No penalty was called. It was a reminder of what playoff hockey looked like in 1970. Hard, chaotic, and often left to the players to sort out. From there, the series settled into a slashing, testy affair. However, the Penguins got the better of it. Any fears the scouts had had in the summer about Briere's ability to hang in there in the tough going of the playoffs were dispelled with one signature play. It came at the end of the series. The series had shifted to Oakland, and with the Penguins tentatively nursing a 3-0 lead, the team played flat and cautious in Game 4. They needed a spark, someone to step up and make a play. Gary Smith, the Seals goaler, had played great all series. With the score tied and his team facing elimination in sudden death overtime, he made what was arguably his best save of the series. However, he kicked his leg out to make the spectacular save and sent the rebound to Briere, who waited at the side of the net. When he found the puck on his stick, he planned a wraparound, but noticed a space between Smith's legs during his flyby, slid the puck along the ice from an awkward angle, and scored the series-clinching goal. As incredible as it seems, that Penguins team was the first in league history to win each of its first 4 playoff games. The Oakland Seals franchise would never again play another playoff game. This was a big moment, one not to be taken for granted. Though the team had a 3-0 stranglehold, that alone was no guarantee of victory. The Penguins and their fans would find that out in a very hard way just 5 years later. It was a modest series in the eyes of the league, but a meaningful one in Pittsburgh. They needed someone who didn't panic in a strange building, someone who could finish a broken play in overtime. In that moment, at 19 years old, Michel Briere gave them exactly that. Hope had arrived. In the Stanley Cup semi-final against the St. Louis Blues, Briere came alive, brawling and scoring 4 goals and 6 points in 6 games. He proved himself to be a versatile player, manning the point on the power play and driving play, no longer just a facilitator. As with his overtime series winner, Briere showed an opportunistic flair, an ability to ooze into the soft areas on the ice undetected, ready for rebounds and backdoor plays. In one memorable moment, which showcased his on-ice poise and vision, Briere stole the puck from a St. Louis defender and set up shop behind the Blues net. He held the puck for 10 seconds while Blues defenders stood by and puck-watched. Then, he calmly flipped a saucer pass onto the stick of Jean Pronovost, who ripped one past Blues tender Jacques Plante. Crowds flocked to watch Briere's inspired play. Game 3 set an attendance record at the Igloo, with over 12,900 fans in the building. They were there to see playoff hockey. Briere gave them hope that the home team would win. Briere scored tie-breaking, game-winning goals in back-to-back games in front of the Penguins faithful, electrifying fans with end-to-end rushes. Blues coach Scotty Bowman sent out his biggest, meanest defenders, Noel Picard and Bob Plager, against the smallish Briere. Briere beat them with superior puck handling and speed, and fooled goalies with head fakes. For a Penguins team that had been the very personification of lunch pail hockey, Briere was a revelation. In the deciding game, Briere scored another tie-breaking goal late in the third period, but it didn't hold up. Ultimately, the Blues won the series, but it was something for the Pens to build on. When the Penguins' season ended, each player received a $5,000 league bonus for reaching the semifinals. With it, he bought a new sports car, a burnt orange Mercury Cougar. For Michel Briere, the summer ahead seemed mapped out. He was set to marry his high school sweetheart in 5 weeks. Their son, Martin, had just turned 1, but the wedding never came. 3 weeks before the ceremony, Briere took his new car out along Route 117 near his home in northern Quebec. He entered a bend too fast, a turn that now bears his name, and the car rolled. He was thrown clear of the vehicle, unconscious at the scene, and never fully recovered. The damage to his brain was severe. News reached Pittsburgh quickly. The first reports were grim, but they carried one crucial detail. He was alive. And where there was life, there was hope. In Quebec, amid a series of emergency operations, Briere could open his eyes, swallow food, and at least once squeeze a hand, but he could not communicate. Small positive signs carried great weight back in Pittsburgh. Fans followed daily updates. The organization set his number 21 aside for the season, waiting to restore it when he returned. Red Kelly believed he might be back by Christmas. But days turned into weeks, and the small improvements stopped. Weeks turned into months. Briere's weight fell to a frail 110 pounds. Doctors cautioned that even if he woke, he would likely never walk again. Some feared he would never breathe without assistance. In Pittsburgh, the updates grew shorter, then less frequent, then silent. He never woke up. On April 13, 1971, 1 year to the day of his overtime winner in Oakland, Michel Briere died. He was 21 years old. For the Penguins, the loss went beyond a promising young center. In one off-season, they lost the only real sense of direction the franchise had ever felt. The optimism of that spring, the crowds, the late-season push, the feeling that something was finally forming, evaporated. The team slipped back towards thin crowds, anonymous rosters, and the old suspicion that whatever they were building in 1970 had been cut off mid-sentence. Everywhere Rogie Vachon went in 1978, the conversation followed him. You're going here, you're going there. Rangers, Capitals, Red Wings. He tried to ignore it, told himself it didn't matter, that he could go out and play his game no matter what the papers said. But that's not how it works. Vachon was 32 years old and playing on an expiring contract. A wife, 3 kids. This next deal had to carry him to the end of his career. He wanted Ken Dryden money. Every goal against started whispering questions. Did that one cost me a year? Did that bad game cost me $50,000? The Kings refused to negotiate during the season, so the rumors followed the team everywhere. On Eastern road trips, Rogie would look down at the crown on his chest, then open the newspapers and read that he was leaving Los Angeles. Rangers, Capitals, Red Wings. What nobody realized at the time was that this contract fight was about to explode into one of the strangest free agency battles the NHL has ever seen, one that would cost Detroit its rookie scoring leader and end up in a U.S. federal courtroom. At the end of May, the contract expired, and on June 1st, Vachon became a free agent. He'd been expecting to be back with the Kings by September, but doubts had set in. He was openly taking offers from other clubs, The news reported on it, and Kings owner Jack Kent Cooke couldn't have been happy about that. Vachon was in the media talking numbers. He said he wanted Ken Dryden money. Vachon had made $150,000 a year on his expiring deal. Now he was hoping for maybe 3 times that. His play had warranted it. Before Marcel Dion had arrived, Vachon was the only bulwark between the Kings and oblivion. He was a 2-time NHL end-of-season All-Star and had played in 3 All-Star games while a member of the Kings. In all 6 of his full seasons with the club, he was top 10 in goaltenders' games played, wins, and shutouts, and was top 10 in save percentage 4 times, same as Dryden. The Rangers reportedly offered $600,000, but for shorter term. Vachon's watchword was security. As spring moved into summer, Vachon became less and less confident he'd return with the Kings. The Kings offered $300,000. 6 or 7 teams were interested. The Kings dragged their feet. Los Angeles area media were already eulogizing his tenure. Fans considered him shopping his services to be a betrayal. Rumors circulated that Vachon had gone to ground, that he was hiding behind his agent. But it wasn't true. He appeared at charity events and even co-hosted a hockey camp for youngsters in the Los Angeles area to help grow the game there. He was teaching kids the fundamentals of the game. But there were no fundamentals to free agency at that point. It was a brand new game, and everybody was winging it. That game had been set up partially by the labor work of Ted Lindsay, the Red Wings' hard-nosed left-winger who helped organize the Players' Labor Union back in the 1950s. He was banished for his efforts. But 20 years had passed, and at the moment, he was the GM in Detroit. And so, he was poised to benefit from the momentum of a ball that he had helped to get rolling in the first place. The Red Wings had become front-runners of the Rogie-Vachon sweepstakes, offering the best balance of number and term. While Vachon was being courted, Kings management scrambled, trying to make a deal for a younger goalie to undermine what little leverage he had left. The Kings tried to trade puck-moving defenseman Gary Sargent to Cleveland for Gilles Meloche. That didn't pan out. But they still had several targets, including Chico Resch of the crowded Islanders, one of Bernie Parent and Wayne Stevenson of Philadelphia, Wayne Thomas and John Davidson of the Rangers, or Gilles Gilbert and Ron Graham from Boston. All the speculation and all the waiting was adding up. Vachon found it hard to sleep at night. He hated the thought of leaving Los Angeles, but the Kings weren't close. Most of the other teams in the race had already backed out, scared off by league rules that forced them into arbitration. That would mean losing a star player to the Kings as compensation for signing Vachon. For the Rangers, that could have meant giving up one of the 2 marquee Swedes they'd just signed, Anders Hedberg or Ulf Nilsson. Owner Sonny Werblin had deep pockets, and Vachon had been penciled in as a top priority heading into the offseason. But giving up a newly acquired star before he even wore a Rangers sweater didn't make sense, so New York pulled back. The free agency system froze most of the market. Teams that may have paid $600,000 a year suddenly turned cautious, knowing that a big contract might cost them a young core piece in return. Vachon's earning landscape shrank, from the Rangers' rumored $600,000 per year down to roughly $300,000 from Detroit. Vachon remained focused on providing security for his family. The Kings, meanwhile, went the other direction. With fewer bidders on the board, they dropped their own number from $300,000 to $200,000. The very system that gave him free agency simultaneously limited his earning potential. Kings fans felt abandoned by Rogie. Rogie felt abandoned by Kings management. For the Kings, it wasn't abandonment, it was business. It was announced on August 9th of 1978 that Rogie had signed with Detroit, though financial details were not immediately released. It was later revealed that Rogie would be paid $1.3 million over 5 years, an average annual value of $260,000. Less than half of what he'd been expecting, but nearly double what he'd been making in LA. Lindsay didn't announce the deal right away. he was busy offering half the roster to LA for compensation so that the Kings wouldn't take him to arbitration. Lindsay offered the Kings Jim Rutherford, Jean Hamel, Dennis Polonich, and Bill Lockheed. But quantity doesn't replace quality on an NHL roster. The Kings wanted Dale McCart and Reed Larson or Willie Huber instead. The case went to arbitration. The Red Wings offered Jim Rutherford and Bill Lockheed. The Kings wisely reduced their request to McCourt only. Toronto Judge Ed Houston filed in the Kings' favor. Only a year earlier, McCourt had been the first overall selection in the amateur draft. As a rookie, he led the Red Wings in scoring with 72 points. The Red Wings were not happy to lose him. In fact, Terrible Ted was furious. The fear of losing McCourt, or any of their other young assets, is the reason Detroit delayed signing Vachon for more than a month. Detroit had already been going through a lengthy rebuild and had stocked the cupboard with good talent. They just lacked a goalie. Vachon's annual number went down by more than half in hopes of lowering the arbitration hit. It didn't work. As disappointed as Wings management was over the loss of McCourt, it was nothing compared to the fan reaction. Thanks to McCourt, Wings fans were excited again. Then, thanks to an international judge's decision, they'd lost him after just a single year for a 33-year-old goalie. Now, they stood outside Olympia Stadium demanding answers. Some ranted, others were dumbfounded. They promised a petition drive. It wasn't the first time the Red Wings had lost a bright young talent to Los Angeles for obscure reasons. Marcel Dion had been shipped out only 3 years earlier after contract disputes left him unhappy in the Motor City. Dion became one of the brightest stars in the league. Now, Red Wings fans were helplessly watching it happen again. And this time, the player actually wanted to be there. Shockwaves from the signing reached Los Angeles in a couple different ways. McCourt refused to report. He filed a suit in U.S. District Court through lawyer Brian Smith, naming the Kings, Red Wings, NHL, and NHLPA as defendants. The suit alleged restraint of trade, restraint of employment, 2 counts of breach of contract, and abuse of an arbitration award. McCourt's case was that he had signed a contract with the Red Wings on the understanding that he'd be playing in Detroit. McCourt asked for the arbitration settlement to be canceled or his contract terminated. Judge Robert Damascio sided with McCourt, ruling that compensation requirements for NHL free agent signings represented a restraining of trade. Damascio said that the rule discourages NHL member clubs from seeking to sign free agents, depresses player salaries, and robs them of the opportunity to put their talents on the free agent market. He went on to suggest that compensation can be obtained just as easily through wisely selected draft choices. McCourt reported to Red Wings camp in Kalamazoo, a happy man. He had nothing against LA, but coaching staff and management had treated him very well in Detroit. For the time being, it was the only place he wanted to play. The Kings were left without what they thought was just compensation for losing Vachon. They claimed in court that the loss of their star goalie resulted in a net loss of $300,000 in season ticket sales. With this in mind, observers get a glimpse into why the Kings were playing such hardball during free agent talks. They were in a no-win situation. Either way was going to cost them $300,000. Ultimately, Vachon didn't even see that kind of money. The Kings also had another, even more visceral problem on their hands. For the moment, they didn't have a goalie, but they had a couple of solutions in their back pockets. Vladimir Dzurilla was the breakout star of the 1976 Canada Cup tournament. For more on that, see our previous video. He'd given the Canadian club fits, though in a losing effort. Now, the Czechoslovakian authorities had given him permission to leave the Iron Curtain and look for work. Dzurilla was already 35 years old, 2 years older than Vachon, but the Kings offered him a 2-year deal as a stopgap while they searched for or developed a younger replacement. But ultimately, he signed in West Germany. The Kings also kicked the tires on John Davidson, but that went nowhere. The Kings went into training camp without a legitimate number one goalie. The top AHL netminder, Mario Lessard, had been named second-team All-Star at his position in 1978, but the club was impatient, and the solution they chose would turn out to be disastrous. Detroit had swung for the fences, knowing the risks, and won both the goalie they wanted and kept the prospect they coveted. But all the tension and drama had frayed nerves around the club. At a summer meet-and-greet function, while the McCourt situation was still up in the air, a boisterous woman told Vachon she was going to boo him after every goal he let in. Vachon knew he had to win over the fans. He wanted badly to get off to a great start and change minds. Nearly 15,000 came out for opening night, which, as a side note, was the final season opener in the old Olympia Stadium. Vachon wore number 40. Not everyone booed, but the ones who promised they would got their chance. He let in 5 goals on just 14 shots against the Blues. The headline shouted, "Vachon flops in debut." In the article, Wings coach Bobby Crom was quoted saying the Wings played like hell and should have run away with the game, but the difference was goaltending. Vachon was hard on himself. He'd had what he considered a rough training camp, and he was still thinking about it in his next start. Early in the game, Sabres sniper Danny Gare came in on a breakaway. Vachon stopped him. One save, and Vachon finally settled in. That one moment set the tone for the rest of the month as he went 5 games without a loss. But then he wouldn't win another until mid-December. By the end of the year, he won only 10 of his 50 appearances. His numbers cratered. He never really settled in Detroit. The next season, he allowed more than 200 goals and was traded to Boston in the offseason. It's impossible to pinpoint where it all went wrong. But if Rogie Vachon carried any baggage with him east, it was probably this. He cared too much. Sometimes, that's heavier to carry than anything else. Before we move on, if you enjoy these quiet late-night hockey stories, consider subscribing to Cold Case Hockey for many more to come. And if you'd like to support the channel further, memberships are now live. Thanks for listening, and now, back to the video. The official story of how Tim Horton died was simple: a late-night car crash. But the crash report and autopsy told a very different story. One involving alcohol, excessive speeds, stimulants, sedatives, and a 4 a.m. drive that should never have happened. For more than 30 years, those details were kept out of public view. Long before the truth finally surfaced, Horton's wrecked car had become a spectacle. Fingers poked through the chain-linked fence, mouths agape, widened eyes scanning the wreckage at the tow yard. They were supposed to be in school, but they had skipped class on a rumor that the broken husk of shattered glass and twisted metal behind the fence was once the car of hockey legend Tim Horton. After the police advised employees at the Simpsons towing yard in St. Catharines to cover the wreckage with a tarp, the crowds finally dispersed. They'd come to gawk. Some people had hoped they could get close enough to snag a macabre souvenir, while others wanted to linger in what precious little remained of the hockey star's presence. The reason for the crowds was because for 20 seasons, Tim Horton patrolled the blue line of the Toronto Maple Leafs, putting together an undeniable Hall of Fame resume, which included 4 Stanley Cups and 6 All-Star teams. His physical strength was legendary. Gordie Howe called him the strongest man in hockey. Every now and then, some young, hotshot rookie would get cheeky with Horton, slash his stick while fighting for a loose puck in the corner, and he would wrap them up in his patented rib-cracking Horton bear hug. The slashing would stop after that. Off the ice, he was mild-mannered and wore thick glasses because of poor eyesight. The combination of strength and poor eyesight prompted Leafs goalie Johnny Bower to nickname him Superman. But after the club fired their longtime coach and GM Punch Imlich, they decided to retool and let the aging star go.
Even then, at the age of 40, he was still one of the best rear guards in the game, evidenced by his selection as a second-team All-Star just a year earlier. It was his third consecutive All-Star team appearance. Regardless, the Leafs traded him to the New York Rangers for Dennis Dupire, not exactly a super return. He toiled there for a season and a half. At the end of the 71 season, he retired. Horton was still virile, still the strongest man in hockey, and already a successful businessman. He grew up during the Great Depression, and so, as did many of his generation, had an appreciation for the kinds of comforts and security money brings. This made him a relentless hard worker and a calculated risk-taker, traits that would help him both on the ice and off the ice when it came to business. For a while, he sold cars. One of the men he sold a car to was Ron Joyce, owner of the U-Donut shop on Ottawa Street in Hamilton, near where Horton lived. After a brief discussion and a business proposal, the friendly and mild-mannered Horton agreed to sponsor the donut shop with his name and image, and U-Donut was rebranded as Tim Horton Donuts. This was in 1964. The shop, specifically with the rebranding, took off. This may have been extremely fortuitous timing, as Horton would have been at the peak of his popularity in the Toronto area. In 1964, Horton set an NHL record for playoff points by a defenseman with 15, while leading the Maple Leafs to their third consecutive Stanley Cup victory. By 71, there were nearly a dozen Tim Horton donut shops around the Hamilton area, and the business was growing rapidly. Retirement wouldn't be a calm, idle rest for Horton. There was too much to do. However, by the end of the 1970-71 NHL campaign, the Pittsburgh Penguins were as flightless as their namesake. They had only made the playoffs once in their first 4 years, and after the shocking death of their young, up-and-coming star center Michel Briere, lacked a strong identity. Penn's head coach Red Kelly was a teammate of Horton's with the Maple Leafs and pleaded with him to come out of retirement to help the faltering Penguins. When Kelly offered him $37,000 to play, which was a third more than he'd made in Toronto, Horton agreed. By the end of the season, though, Horton, who had been known for his strength and resilience, suffered a broken ankle and a separated shoulder, which limited him to 44 games. But Horton's presence with the team gave them a feeling of stability and the added jolt of confidence needed to make the playoffs. Though they were unceremoniously swept by powerhouse Chicago, the Penguins became a playoff fixture through the rest of the decade, solidifying the franchise and legitimizing the team. It would take 20 years, but the Penguins would eventually get their revenge on Chicago. Horton, bruised and battered, would retire once again. However, Imlich, who was then coach and GM of the newly formed Buffalo Sabres, needed a mentor for his young, inexperienced team. Imlich needed a stabilizing force and a father figure for his young team, and he knew exactly where to find one. This time, Horton did not agree. He had enough going on with his business and family life that it was time to walk away from the game. Then, Imlich offered Horton a $100,000 contract, which for the time was an enormous sum for an NHL defenseman. Horton, ever the Depression-era child, couldn't say no to a deal like that, and came out of retirement once again. And once again, Horton helped turn the franchise around. The Sabres were strong in scoring with the famous French Connection line, checking, led by Craig Ramsay and Don Luce, another former Horton teammate with the Rangers, and got good goaltending. But they were a little weak on the back end. At age 43, Horton was no longer the 30-point producer he once was, but he gave them exactly what they needed. His very presence helped mold the careers of young defenders Jim Schoenfeld and Mike Robitaille in particular into reliable rear guards. By year's end, Horton once again found himself a major part of a playoff team. The Sabres put in a scrappy effort against the eventual Cup champs Montreal, taking them to 6 games. But once again, when it was all said and done, Horton retired. And that's where the story should have ended. Horton retiring from pro hockey to focus on family and business. But that's not how the story ended. Imlich, fueled by the taste of success and the promise of greater success to come, wanted one more year from the 23-year NHL veteran. When Horton turned down the offer of another year at $100K, Imlich upped the ante, offering $150,000 for the year. It was an undeniably sweet offer, but he still refused. Then, Horton, still the car dealer at heart, threw out a wild suggestion, one that he didn't think would actually work. He'd sign the deal if Imlich threw in a brand new car, and not just any car, but his dream car, a De Tomaso Pantera, a sporty Italian-built coupe with a Ford V8 engine. To Horton's surprise, Imlich and the Sabres owners agreed. The 1973-74 season didn't go as well as the previous one. After a solid 7-3 start, they began to flounder. The Sabres suffered through winless streaks of 5 or 6 games 3 separate times and found themselves bobbing around 500 by mid-February. On the morning of February 20th, the Sabres were in 5th place in the East Division, and they were going to visit the team they looked up at in the standings, the Toronto Maple Leafs. It was one of those geographical oddity kind of games, a road trip to Toronto in the middle of a 5-game homestand for Buffalo. The Sabres players chartered the team bus for the quick 100-mile trip. If all went well, everyone could be home and in their own beds by just after midnight. But Horton decided not to take the bus, but took the Pantera instead, so he could spend a little extra time with his family and talk business after the game with Joyce. At the morning skate, a puck hit Horton in the jaw, causing him tremendous pain. During the game in Toronto, Horton played through the pain, but was unable to take a regular shift by the 3rd period. His play was inspiring enough for him to be voted 3rd star of the game, despite being held pointless in a 4-2 loss. After the game, Horton took a walk with Imlich while the other players boarded the bus. Horton told him he felt like he'd let the team down. The Sabres had clawed their way back to within 1 goal after stumbling out of the gate and giving away a 3-0 lead. But with Horton out of the regular action, the team faded late and couldn't sustain their comeback bid. His pride hurt. Horton drove to the Tim Horton Donuts office in Oakville to meet with Joyce. Horton sat in the dark, his coat and driver's gloves on, his feet on the table, an ice pack wrapped around his jaw, and a vodka and soda in his hand. At around 3 a.m., he called his wife Lori to tell her he was going home. He also called his brother, who recognized that he'd been drinking, and urged him to sleep it off in the office. Tim didn't heed his brother's advice. If he had, it would have saved his life. According to Joyce, before he left the office, Horton grabbed a handful of painkillers and downed them. However, no painkillers were found in his system as per the autopsy. Traces of Dexamyl, a sedative, was found in his system along with several yellow and purple pills found at the crash site. These yellow and purple pills were Dexamyl and Dexedrine, an amphetamine popular with the jet set at the time. A bottle of vodka was also found among the wreckage. It seemed Horton would drink to excess, then take a stimulant to stay alert, then a sedative to balance the stimulant. It's a cocktail that might have seemed to work in the past, but was bound to catch up to him. It's only by the grace of God he didn't hurt anybody else when he inevitably crashed his vehicle. The story that Ron Joyce tells is of a guy with a sore jaw who'd had a couple of drinks and took a few painkillers before hitting the road. However, the autopsy tells the story of a man with twice the legal limit of alcohol in his system, taking uppers to stay alert for a 4 a.m. drive home. One he should never have even attempted. Looking at the evidence, it makes you wonder how many times he'd actually gotten away with it before. Horton sped along Queen Elizabeth Way at 100 to 110 miles an hour. A driver alerted police that a sports car was driving dangerously fast, and an OPP officer was dispatched and awaited Horton's car in St. Catharines. This was at about 4:30 in the morning. The officer couldn't keep up with Horton's excessive speed, and before he'd even realized he was being pursued, he'd lost the officer. The officer told the press that he was doing 100 miles an hour, and even at that speed, lost sight of Horton's vehicle. Moments later, that officer came upon the crash scene. Horton was the first NHL player to die from drunk driving, but unfortunately he wouldn't be the last, not nearly. Because they found his number in Horton's possession, Sabres head coach Joe Crozier was the first to find out about his death. It was a terrible shock to everyone that knew him. Amazingly, the Sabres actually played a game that night. Both the Sabres and their opponents, the Atlanta Flames, wore black armbands in honor of Horton. The details of Horton's crash report and autopsy were not released to the public. It wasn't until 2005 that a journalist with the Ottawa Citizen got a hold of the records and revealed the shocking details of Horton's intoxication. The Sabres and Flames skated numbly to a 4-4 tie that night.
Picture this. You're the most popular hockey player on the most popular hockey team in the world. Night after night, you feel the roar of the crowd in your packed home building as you play on the club's top line with your best friend. Your wife is home, 7 months pregnant. You feel safe, secure, optimistic. In a matter of hours, you find yourself standing at the blue line of a half-empty, unfamiliar building in an unfamiliar city. Your uniform is all the wrong colors, and the organist is playing the wrong home anthem, and nobody even knows how or why you ended up there. This is the story of when Lanny McDonald was traded to the Colorado Rockies. Everybody loves Lanny. Even today, nearly 40 years after his retirement, his visage remains one of the most iconic in hockey. In the late 1970s, he was a key member of a potentially championship-level nucleus. He enjoyed 4 consecutive 40-goal seasons as a Leaf and was prominent in community outreach, hospital visits, youth programs, Special Olympics. Lanny was already forging a legend both on and off the ice. And so, it was all the more shocking when he was unceremoniously traded to what was then the NHL's answer to Siberia, the Colorado Rockies. Maple Leafs fans expressed shock, disbelief, and anger at the news of the trade. Some even protested outside of Maple Leaf Gardens the following night. Toronto team captain Darryl Sittler cut the C off his sweater, resigning in protest. On the surface, it was a move designed to shake up the core of a team that had lost 2 consecutive years to the Montreal Canadiens in embarrassing series sweeps, and 3 consecutive seasons before that to the Philadelphia Flyers. They were contenders, they were close, they just weren't a championship-level team yet. Beneath the surface, fans understood that Lanny McDonald wasn't the problem. Ownership was. The many abuses of Harold Ballard as principal owner of the Maple Leafs are numerous and legendary. Ballard had been with the Leafs organization for decades. He has his name engraved on the Stanley Cup and was even inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame as a builder for his work with the Leafs. But by the time he had a controlling share of the team in 1971, he had developed a reputation as tight-fisted, combative, and controlling. According to one apocryphal tale, in 1964, the Beatles performed to a packed house at MLG on a hot and humid day. Ballard opened the doors early, tampered with the building's climate, and increased the cost of drinks at the concession stands. In another famous tale, when the league mandated nameplates on the backs of jerseys, Ballard made them the same color as the jersey so that fans couldn't read them in order to prevent a drop in program sales. He was 1 part P.T. Barnum and 1 part Boss Tweed. In 1972, Ballard was convicted of a whopping 47 counts of fraud, tax evasion, theft from Maple Leaf Gardens, and using Gardens funds to renovate his home. Despite spending a year in Millhaven prison, Ballard maintained an iron-fisted grip on the organization from behind the prison walls. Reporters described his level of control from behind bars as uncanny, authoritarian, and absurd. Upon his release, Ballard's domineering took on epic proportions. He became more petty and vindictive, more mistrustful of those under him. What had once been a hands-on approach now looked like a man asserting absolute authority, not only over the team, but over everyone within its orbit. By this time, Ballard's view of his players had hardened from perception into policy, resulting in disputes that effectively kneecapped the organization's ability to build a contender. Players with influence bothered him, the best players, men like former captain Dave Keon, who had become a symbol of independence inside the building. Ballard saw a unified, confident locker room as a threat to his authority, not an asset. Every dollar that went to one of his players was, in essence, a dollar taken out of his own pocket. The WHA was inflating salaries, and the NHLPA was gaining strength, which only deepened his hostility toward both. Sittler was vice president of the Players' Union and had become the face of the franchise, beloved by fans and teammates alike. The Maple Leafs had built a solid core of Sittler, McDonald, Tiger Williams, defensemen Borja Salming and Ian Turnbull, and an acrobatic show-stopping goalie in Mike Palmateer. But at the heart of the team was Sittler. His growing influence in the building and the greater community at large threatened Ballard. So after 5 straight playoff disappointments and escalating tensions within the building, Ballard sought to tighten the reins. He wanted to stamp out the country club atmosphere around the Maple Leafs, and in the 1979 offseason, brought back Punch Imlich to run the team. Imlich had been the Leafs' head coach and GM during their glory days of the 1960s, and he was brought in to be Ballard's proxy. Back then, Imlich was answerable to a 7-member board that included Ballard, so he knew that he was bringing in someone agreeable and controllable. Imlich had a reputation as an abusive taskmaster, and it's believed by some that his Maple Leaf team sprouted into a dynasty not because of him, but in spite of him. Imlich believed that the Leafs had about 5 or 6 good players, and the rest of the roster needed to be overhauled. The macho head games began almost immediately. If the hiring of Imlich was the opening salvo in a war between players and management, then the warning shot came when outgoing GM Jim Gregory dealt popular and acrobatic goaltender Mike Palmateer to the Washington Capitals, arguably the worst team in the league, for draft picks. The trade signaled to players and fans alike that the organization was no longer interested in building a contender. It also made plain that management now functioned as the enforcement arm of ownership. As the season began, Imlich imposed a dress code. Players were no longer allowed to drink beer on the team bus or plane. The players bristled. Sittler and Imlich butted heads, but Sittler had a trump card. Sittler had a clause in his contract that required he be paid $500,000 to agree to any trade involving him. With the tight-wad Ballard in the owner's box, Sittler was essentially immovable. It didn't stop Imlich from trying. He offered Sittler to Buffalo for Gilbert Perreault. The Sabres rejected the offer. He offered Sittler to the Flyers for Rick McClish and Moose DuPont. That deal never materialized either. Imlich and Ballard wanted to undermine Sittler's authority in the locker room and emphasize their own. Then they devised a spiteful plan. If they couldn't deal away Sittler himself, they'd just trade away his best friend, confidant, and right-hand man, Lanny McDonald. The trade was never about Lanny McDonald. It was about hurting Sittler and undermining his authority. As for the trade itself, Lanny was packaged with young stay-at-home defender Joel Quenneville to a Colorado Rockies team that was desperate for both offense and defense. In return, the Leafs got forwards Wilf Paymont and Pat Hickey. The deal landed like a knockout blow after a series of earlier roster jabs, which saw Imlich deal away younger players for farmhands and the bizarre choice of re-signing retired 41-year-old defender Carl Brewer. Imlich may have been trying to recreate his blueprint for a championship team from the 1960s of relying heavily on cagey and trusted veterans. Brewer had long been an opponent of Sittler's negotiating agent Alan Eagleson. The move was strictly political. Brewer hadn't played in nearly a decade. In essence, he was the ultimate company man. It's a telling detail that Imlich had to look that far back to find a player who was more willing to side with management than his fellow players. Lanny was devastated. His family had settled in Toronto. They had just bought a new house, and he had no reason to believe he would be moved. No one did. Even Floyd Smith, the Leafs head coach, was caught off guard. The shock spread through the room and into the stands. Fans protested outside Maple Leaf Gardens the next night. Inside the organization, the meaning was clearer. This wasn't a hockey trade. It was part of a campaign to isolate Sittler by removing the players closest to him. Before the next game, Sittler quietly cut the captain's C off his jersey. He didn't grandstand, he didn't call a press conference. He just did what he thought was right. When management learned what he had done, they tried to hand the letter to Tiger Williams, a player Ballard adored. Tiger had even given Ballard a bearskin rug from a hunting trip, which Ballard kept beneath his desk. But Tiger was no company man. Out of respect for Sittler, he refused. The Maple Leafs played the rest of the season without a captain. The timeline suggests that it was another punitive move that sent Tiger to the Vancouver Canucks a month and a half later, another of the NHL's laughingstock franchises. He blossomed there, becoming that team's emotional leader and their goals leader the next season. Quenneville had been Salming's defense partner, and including him in the deal fit the pattern. Another piece of the core hurt, another working relationship broken. Camaraderie and chemistry evaporated. The roster subsequently stripped to the bolts. Between 1979 and 1983, the Leafs lost 12 consecutive playoff games. Paymon was a good player, a prototypical power forward, but when he arrived in Toronto, he entered a no-win situation. Early reports suggest the Leafs intended to flip him for more assets, and Mark Napier's name surfaced in speculation, but no deal materialized. Paymon was expected to report to the team that Saturday, but he refused, not because he was unhappy with the trade or unwilling to play for the Leafs, but because his wife was giving birth to their child. When Imlich was informed of the situation, he was less than sympathetic, saying he traded for the player, not his wife. Eventually, Paymon reported and finished the year second in team scoring. Sittler responded on the ice. He'd been scoring at around a point-per-game pace before the trade, but exploded with 69 in the final 44 games, including 5 nights with 4 or more points. Paymon led the team in scoring the following year. Hickey lasted a season and a half and was eventually moved for a 5th-round pick. Ultimately, Paymon did get traded, this time to the Quebec Nordiques for Miroslav Fraiture. Fraiture was dealt many years later for Darren Veach. Veach was dealt for Keith Osborne. Osborne was taken by the Tampa Bay Lightning in the expansion draft. In the 1980 offseason, Imlich suffered a heart attack. Ballard named himself acting general manager and struck a deal with Sittler. He would return as captain. Ballard also re-signed Borje Salming, offering a contract Imlich had refused. Imlich came back for training camp but suffered a second heart attack. Ballard told the media that Imlich was finished as general manager. Aside from Salming, after a whirlwind of activity, the team the Leafs iced at the end of the 1982 season was completely unrecognizable from the team they had iced at the beginning of the 1980 season. Toronto missed the playoffs that spring, losing 7-1 to Philadelphia in their final game. A Flyers team centered by Daryl Sittler. The teardown was complete. Things got so ugly on and off the ice that isolated groups of fans started showing up at MLG with brown paper bags over their heads. In an eerie coincidence, years earlier, Ballard once tried to force Leafs coach Roger Nielsen to wear a brown paper bag over his head during a losing streak. Nielsen refused. Eventually, Ballard died. His story came to a close, but the damage had been done. One of pro sports' most storied franchises had been run into the ground by years of driving away its stars, alienating its fans, and eroding its own identity. Lanny ended up going from one dysfunctional situation to another, but the difference between the two was jarring. From one moment to the next, he went from MLG, the center of the hockey universe, to half-empty McNichols Sports Arena. While the Maple Leafs had struggled to maintain a strong and proud identity, the Rockies didn't have one to begin with. They were a team with no roots and no stability. The Rockies won just 5 of Lanny's first 11 games with the club. He didn't pout, He didn't complain or withdraw. He just went out there and competed. By the end of the 1980 campaign, the Rockies had won 8 of the 46 games after his arrival. Don Cherry, the coach in Colorado, was one of hockey's biggest personalities. Loud, funny, and opinionated. He complained openly and often about some of his players, especially the goaltenders, but he had nothing but respect for Lanny, even calling him one of the finest men he ever coached. Lanny immediately became the heart and soul of the Rockies, their inspirational player and best forward. It became apparent that Toronto lost more than a consistent 40-goal scorer. They lost a culture carrier. McDonald stayed with the club for 2 years, leading them in scoring all the time, but seeing very little change in the way of results. Just before the Rockies shuttered operations and moved to New Jersey, they dealt McDonald, an Alberta native, to Calgary. After 2 years in hockey's wilderness, he was not only freed, he was going home. When he heard the news of the trade, Lanny wept. There, Lanny found a team on the rise. Hungry, hardworking, blue-collar, Western. Lanny fit the mold to a T. The fans embraced him as a returning native son, and Lanny responded with a career year, scoring 66 goals, still a club record. His scoring touch faded with age, as it does, but not his presence. When he settled into a bottom six leadership role, it fit him like a glove. He was co-captain of the team and an important presence in a room full of star talents. Off the ice, Lanny became the NHL's public face for charitable works, fully embraced and respected by the community at large. Meanwhile, the Toronto Maple Leafs floundered, lacking a strong veteran core in the room. In 1989, Lanny's final season, he scored his 500th goal and 1,000th point, erasing any doubt that he would be enshrined in hockey's Hall of Fame. That year, the Calgary Flames won the Stanley Cup. Lanny scored a goal in the deciding game in Montreal. When the Stanley Cup trophy was presented to the Flames, his teammates pushed Lanny forward so that he could be the first to lift it. The fact that it happened against the Canadiens, the very team that had authored the Maple Leafs dismantling a decade earlier, was almost Homeric in proportion. It's the kind of storybook ending that a career like Lanny's deserved, an ending that Salming and Sittler never enjoyed. But they weren't the problem in Toronto. Ownership was. After Ballard's death, Maple Leafs ownership and management opened the doors to alumni, no longer making former players pay for tickets to enter the building. Cliff Fletcher, the man who brought Lanny home to Calgary, took over as GM in Toronto and made a reconciliation with Sittler on the team's behalf. Ultimately, all 3 of their numbers were retired. Sittler's and Salming's in Toronto, and Lanny's in Calgary. The trading of Lanny McDonald was neither the first nor the last blow in the Maple Leafs Civil War, but it was the point of no return. A house divided against itself cannot stand, and when the Leafs fell, they fell spectacularly. The Maple Leaf story exposes the dangers of a rebuild, especially an unrighteous rebuild caused by spite and pettiness. The Leafs have felt like a cursed franchise since that time. Team culture and identity can be a fragile thing. Toronto never seemed to find the right mix to correct theirs. Even now, more than 45 years later, they're still trying to find it. The Leafs were like a kid building a sandcastle on a beach, and the project was coming together. Then, a bully comes along and kicks the castle over, and here's the twist. That bully was the kid's own father. For 2 magical years, Bernie Parent was the best goalie in the world. 2 Stanley Cups, 2 Conn Smythe trophies, 2 Vezinas, 2 first-team All-Star selections. It's hard to find a better 2-year peak for any position in hockey. For goalies, this might be the summit. And then, almost as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The Flyers' budding dynasty stalled. The winds slowed. The magic cooled from supernatural to merely very good. By 1977, Parent was still an all-star, but the numbers had begun to slip. His save percentage fell below .900, and by the end of the playoffs, he wasn't even the starter anymore. Wayne Stevenson had taken the net. Perrant reclaimed the job the following season and delivered one last burst of brilliance. The numbers were still absurd when he played, but the games were becoming fewer. Injuries were starting to creep in, and before long, they would end the career of the greatest goalie the world had ever seen almost overnight. Perrant cruised through the 1978-79 season like a yacht on calm waters. He was 33 years old and on the downswing of an already Hall of Fame-worthy career. Slowly increasing skill and parity around the league had begun to overcome the Flyers' once dominant grit and goaltending combo. But Perrant was still among the top-tier goalies in the league and was expected to carry the load for the Flyers into the early 80s. Flyers coach Pat Quinn had Perrant on a rotation with Stevenson with no immediate plans to change things up. February 17, 1979, Perrant's number came up in the rotation. The Flyers faced the Rangers that night. The Rangers were 5 points ahead of them in the standings, and they were both behind the Flames and the Islanders. It was the proverbial 4-point game, and there was much at stake. Philadelphia was staring down the abyss of a last-place finish. But they were at home, where Perrant had always been most comfortable. He laced up his skates, strapped on his pads, and put in his contact lenses and got to work, just like any other game day. 5 minutes into the game, Bill Barber put the Flyers up 1-0. All season long, the Flyers had been forced to rally late against the Rangers. It looked like this game might turn out different for Philly. 13 minutes in, Rangers rookie Don Maloney stepped in front of Perrant for a screen. Only a rookie would try to get away with something like that in Philly. So Jimmy Watson steps in and plays cop. But those Philadelphia defenders play rough, and he hauls Maloney to the ice. On the way down, the butt end of Watson's stick ends up getting caught in the eye hole of Perrant's mask. Perrant knew it was bad right away. He got up, tossed his mask aside, and skated towards the bench, feeling around his right eye like it might have fallen out. Watson got called for holding on the play. Perrant was taken to the hospital. Initial reports from the Flyers suggested Perrant would be out at least a week, maybe 2. For the moment, he was blind in that eye. He had suffered conjunctival abrasions with 2 cuts on the whites of his right eye. Doctors said the damage may have been made worse by the fact that he wore contact lenses. Bleeding in the internal chamber of the eye was also detected. By the end of the week, the news turned grim. Rumors began to surface that the injury might be career-threatening. At that point, he still couldn't see. All told, he had suffered 7 distinct injuries to the eye, 5 of which healed, but 2 were chronic. A constant buildup of pressure and dislocation of the lens caused problems with focus and depth perception. Recovery was a long, arduous process. Bernie would sit in a chair in the hospital. The doctor would toss a tennis ball to him and he couldn't catch it. How could he be expected to catch a slap shot? Ultimately, the doctors pulled the plug. At the end of May of that year, the Flyers called a press conference at the Spectrum. Bernie, wearing dark glasses and looking despondent and unshaven, was still in shock as he sat there, cameras flashing. On the advice of 3 expert ophthalmologists, Bernie announced his retirement. Hockey careers usually wind down slowly. Perrant had already cemented his place as a legend of the game. The next few years were mapped out in front of him. He would mentor the next wave of Flyers goalies while continuing to provide a steadying presence and leadership to a team in transition. But Perrant's career stopped cold. When he missed training camp, that's when it hit him. On opening night of the next season, the Flyers retired Perrant's jersey. He should have been starting that game. He was depressed. He was a young man in the prime of his life, and his career had been wrenched from him. For a while, he turned to alcohol, just long enough to recognize what a problem it was, and what a crutch. Perrant wasn't the first post-career athlete to find himself feeling rudderless, and he wouldn't be the last. After successfully enlisting the aid of Alcoholics Anonymous, he found his compass. In the summer of 1982, the Flyers announced that they were bringing in Bernie to be the goalie coach. Interestingly, he was replacing Jacques Plante, who had mentored Bernie during their time together in Toronto. A decade earlier than that, in Montreal, Bernie would stare out the front window in fascination as the famous Plante would bound up the front steps of his neighbor's house to visit his sister. Now, Bernie was going to impart everything he had learned to the next generation of Flyers goalies. During his time as goalie coach, Pelle Lindbergh, Bob Froese, and Ron Hextall all won Vezina or Jennings trophies. He left the post in 1990 to focus on business pursuits. But Bernie never left the Flyers. One of the great thrills for Flyers fans attending home games was the chance to meet Bernie Parent. He'd always be there, greeting fans on the concourse, the team's goodwill ambassador. In 2011, Bernie suited up for the Flyers one last time in the alumni game before that year's Winter Classic. It came against the Rangers. The alumni game featured many Flyers and Rangers legends, but the biggest cheer came when the public address announcer introduced Parent. He smiled warmly as he skated toward his goal crease, waving to the crowd as 45,000 fans cheered and chanted his name. It was Look up at the retired numbers hanging from the rafters of Rogers Place in Edmonton. One is not like the others. You have all-time legends, Gretzky, Curry, Messier, Coffey, and then, number 3, Al Hamilton. Today we're going to answer the question, just who is this guy anyway? The 1966 Memorial Cup was a showdown of the top 2 defensive prospects in the game. Bobby Orr represented the East, playing for the Oshawa Generals of the OHA. Al Hamilton was from the West, of the Edmonton Oil Kings. The 2 star defenders electrified the Maple Leaf Garden crowd, trading end-to-end rushes. Hamilton and the Oil Kings dominated the series, winning in 6. Bill Hunter was the GM for Edmonton. 6 years later, Hunter was organizing the WHA, a new professional league to rival the NHL. Hamilton was the top defenseman on the second-year Buffalo Sabres. He finished 4th in team scoring and wore the A on his sweater as alternate captain. He knew Hunter would come calling. He was just worried about what would happen if he did. It had been an uphill battle to crack the Rangers lineup and stay with the big team. Brad Park usurped his role as young puck mover, and he was left exposed in the expansion draft. Sabres GM Punch Imlich made sure Hamilton was the second defenseman off the board, and the first for Buffalo. In year 1, he was their number 1 on the ice. After the season, Hamilton looked for a raise. His relationship with Imlich curdled. Imlich kept Hamilton off the power play all the next season, but he still finished 4th in team scoring. When Hunter called, he offered Hamilton $80,000 a year for 5 years, plus a $5,000 raise annually. The offer was significantly more than what he made in Buffalo. Hamilton didn't want to leave Buffalo, but Hunter kept calling, kept pestering, and kept dangling a payday in front of him. Hunter told him that Edmonton was going to be the greatest hockey city in Canada. Hamilton was skeptical, but he was sold on the money, which was guaranteed for 2 years, even if the WHA never played a single game. Hamilton met with Seymour and Northey Knox and told them the situation. He didn't want to leave. He enjoyed his time in Buffalo. But you only play so many years, and you need to build as big a nest egg as you can. The ball was in Imlich's court to match or exceed the offer. He offered a $2,000 raise. When asked about Hamilton leaving, Imlich muttered something about how he probably wasn't going to make the team next year anyhow. Imlich called in the retired Tim Horton to replace him. For more on that story, see our previous video. During his first year with the Oilers, Hamilton was named captain. After the first game against the LA Sharks, Hamilton thought he'd made a horrible mistake. He says the game had 100 brawls and went on to 2 a.m. But as the year went on, Hamilton and the league found its footing. He finished second in team scoring with 61 points, but struggled a bit with consistency. At times he looked like the best puck-carrying defender in the WHA circuit. At others, Hunter called him a reclamation project. The Oilers' defensive core was strong, probably better than some NHL expansion teams, and Hamilton was the clear leader of the back end. He and Barry Long were the only big men of the group. His job was to punish opposition forwards in front of the net, separate them from the puck, then move it back up ice. In year 2, he hit 59 points and was voted to the WHA All-Star team. Oilers coach Brian Shaw called him the best captain you ever saw. He even works at keeping the coach's morale up. But because he was the best, much was expected of him. The Northlands Coliseum faithful would get on him for a mistake. In 1974, they would find out just how much they would miss him when he was gone. One night, late in the year, while making one of his trademark end-to-end rushes, Hamilton crashed into the goalpost. His knee was shattered. Surgeons had to remove about half of his kneecap. He missed the rest of the 1974-75 season. Some doubted he could come back from such an injury. Edmonton observers took note. The Oilers went from having one of the best defense cores to one of the worst practically overnight. Nearly recovered and getting ready to rejoin the team for the playoffs, Hamilton tripped going down the stairs at the family home and re-broke his knee. It happened to be on April Fool's Day, but the injury was no joke. Initial reports indicated the injury was career-threatening. Hamilton himself believed them. He wasn't yet 30 years old and his career was likely over. He was despondent. But a visit and a chat with team doctor John Harvey and an optimistic evaluation of the x-rays lifted his spirits. He missed the first 20 games of the 75-76 season. The Oilers were still weak defensively. Management pushed him to return, but his mobility wasn't there. The fans got on him for rushing back before he was ready. Before long, opponents realized he couldn't turn while defending, and Hamilton was left on an island in the defensive zone. It was humiliating. He finished the year with 34 points in 54 games, but a -8. After that year, Hamilton was stripped of the captaincy. The next season, he found himself in head coach Bep Guedolin's doghouse. The next season, Hamilton's knee felt strong again, and he had a bounce back, a career year. He was nearly a point per game through 3/4 of the season when he suffered yet another horrendous injury. Houston's John Gray sent a rising 35-foot slapper straight into Hamilton's eye. They told him he'd be in hospital for 2 or 3 days, but weeks went by before his vision returned. He said it was like there was a film over his eye. He couldn't read, couldn't watch TV. He just laid there, feeling helpless. Before long, the Oilers' season ended without him. He was voted almost unanimously as a first-team All-Star, but that provided little comfort. The following season would be the last of the WHA. The Oilers were scheduled to merge with the NHL at the end of the campaign. The whispers started early. He's too slow. He's not an NHL-caliber defenseman. With the eye injury and the threat of permanent blinding still fresh in his mind, Hamilton played tentatively. His passes were off target, and he couldn't fully commit to blocking a shot. He'd still do it, but he would be self-conscious of his head placement. Hockey is an instinctive, reactionary game, and Hamilton knew he wasn't playing the right way. The 79 Oilers were a dominant team, but lost to the Winnipeg Jets in the Avco Cup final. When it was all said and done, despite the horrific injuries, Hamilton ended up the WHA Oilers' all-time leader in games played, assists, and points. But thanks to declining play, there was no guarantee that Hamilton would join the team when it made its NHL debut the following season. In the summer of 1979, he trained harder than he ever had before, pushing himself into the best shape of his life at age 33. The physical and psychological damage from the eye injury was gone. He felt like he had a few more good years in him. But he had a slow training camp. He watched the Oilers lose their first NHL game against Chicago from home. When he got into the lineup, he scored 8 points in 9 games. In early November, He stepped on Islanders defenseman Stefan Pearson's stick racing for a loose puck in the offensive zone and slammed heavily into the boards. The impact separated his shoulder. He had surgery immediately. A pin was placed in his shoulder to hold it together, and he missed 9 weeks. During his time off, he trained like a madman, desperately trying to get back into the lineup. He became a daily fixture at the Oilers' training facility. Within a few weeks, however, the shoulder had already begun to atrophy. He could barely lift 2 pounds. Gradually, his regimen intensified until he was cleared to return to the lineup in mid-January. He played a handful of games, then was sent to the press box. After that, he was sent down to Houston of the Central League, where he played another 4 games during the NHL All-Star break. When he was recalled, he was sent straight back to the press box. In March, he returned to the lineup and stayed in it until the end of the year. He picked up 10 points in his first 9 games back. But as the season winded down, he was held off the score sheet and only dressed for one of the Oilers' 3 playoff games against the Flyers. It had been a season of ups and downs. His return to the NHL resulted in 19 points in 31 games. But injuries had finally caught up to him. He retired that summer. His number 3 was retired at the Oilers' 1980 home opener in front of the largest crowd to ever witness a hockey game in Canada at the time. Those who weren't there don't understand. Hamilton was the anchor of not only the defense, but the entire Oilers franchise during a nearly decade-long period of instability. For a team looking for an identity, that's everything. Stop me if you've heard this one before. The NHL was looking for a way to revamp their tired All-Star Game format and look toward international competition as a solution. On his way to Moscow to discuss more opportunities, NHL President John Ziegler stopped by an antique shop in London and found a bowl that had been commissioned 150 years earlier by Queen Victoria. Ziegler thought it would make a good trophy, so he brought it back and took it with him to Moscow to pitch his idea for a new on-ice meeting. The idea was to play an NHL All-Star team against the Soviet All-Star team in a 3-game series at Madison Square Garden. It would be called the Challenge Cup. On the surface, it sounded important. It sounded bold. It sounded like a big deal. The only problem was that no one in America cared. By 1979, it was clear. International hockey, especially involving the Soviets, was always a ratings bonanza. But early TV projections for the Challenge Cup looked grim. 300 million people were expected to tune in worldwide, including 220 in the Soviet Union, but only 7 million in America. CBS intended to broadcast the 3rd period of Game 2 during a sports variety show, and that would be the extent of American TV exposure. To make matters worse, CBS threatened to pull the broadcast from its schedule due to a conflict over board advertisements. According to CBS, Madison Square Garden board ads upset their own sponsors and violated FCC regulations. NHL President John Ziegler was in a bind. He wanted to maintain good relations with network television, as the NHL hadn't had a U.S. broadcast deal for some time. Hockey was still seen as niche and regional at the time. The board ads brought in $300,000 in revenue for the NHL, while the CBS deal was worth only $35,000. The board ads stayed. Ziegler continued to negotiate. The NHL All-Stars were picked by the fans, including the starting lineup. The team featured 23 Hockey Hall of Famers, but was thin on defense thanks to illness and injuries to Dennis Potvin, Guy Lapointe, and Brad Park. The Soviet team was considered the best of all time. The lineup boasted 7 members of the IIHF Hall of Fame. Even then, it could have been stronger, but injuries to Alexander Maltsev and Slava Fedosov prevented them from appearing in the tournament. Still, it was a stronger lineup than the one the Soviets had sent to the 1976 Canada Cup. Over the previous 4 winters, the Soviets had sent their big league teams over to North America for friendly exhibition games against NHL teams. The Soviet club's record was 10-5-2 to that point, but the competition was less than friendly.
Only 1 week earlier, the Philadelphia Flyers had made the Soviet wings leave the game over dirty and rough play. Bobby Clarke marveled at the Soviets' discipline to take punishment and not turn around to retaliate. He said he would look at their faces and wonder what their lives were like. Across the hall, Soviet star Helmut Balderas said the exact same thing in an interview. Clarke also said, "No matter what language a guy is talking, if he calls you a son of a bitch, you know it." The games were all sellouts. Inside Madison Square Garden, more than 17,000 had paid $10 to $25 each, anticipating a great game. The best players in the world competing head-to-head, mind you, with very little at stake. Outside the arena, scalpers were hawking tickets for $150. The fan-selected opening lineup for the NHL team was Clarke centering Guy Lafleur and Steve Shutt. Before the game, Lafleur sat nervously in his stall, leg bouncing, knowing he would have to start. Finally, he said to himself, "Let's give everything from the start." Lafleur scored 16 seconds after the opening faceoff, with a deke on Soviet goalie Vladislav Tretiak. After the opening, Team NHL coach Scotty Bowman went with his regular lines. He had Clarke centering Bob Gainey and Bill Barber. They didn't score 16 seconds into their time together, but they shut down the Soviets' top line and Balderas. At the time, Balderas was considered by some to be the most skilled player in the world. But as Clarke said, when you put Gainey on a guy, you just write that guy off. Team NHL hit everything that moved, disrupting Soviet timing. The Soviets countered with a dump and chase strategy that didn't work. By the halfway mark of the first, it was 2-0 NHL, and the Soviets hadn't registered a shot. Team NHL even dominated in the face-off circle, winning 54 of 79 draws. Because it was total domination, most who watched it considered it a boring game. Team NHL skated to a 4-2 victory. Bowman had only dressed 4 defensemen and considered using Gainey as a spare on the back end, but didn't. By the end of the third period, his 4 defenders, Larry Robinson, Serge Savard, Borje Salming, and Barry Beck, were gassed. Beck said, "We stopped skating in the third, and we can't have that kind of letdown again." Soviet official Valentin Sich was disappointed with the Balderas line and the veteran line of Vladimir Petrov, Boris Mikhailov, and Valery Karlamov for being slow, but he singled out Lafleur for praise. Game 2 would be refereed by Viktor Dombrovsky, who was considered the worst in the world by some. Team NHL was concerned that he would even up the series if given the chance. Before Game 2, a workaround agreement was reached for CBS to broadcast the third period on a delayed feed to edit out images of the offending board ads. When the puck dropped, the Soviets played much better. They had been embarrassed in Game 1, but found their legs in Game 2. To the surprise of Team NHL, the Soviets came out of the gate throwing clean hits and had already adjusted for their patterns. The Soviets would send 2 forecheckers deep to throw the body and disrupt timing passes. For the most part, the strategy worked. By the halfway point of the second, the NHLers had only registered 7 shots on goal. The problem was, they'd scored on 4 of them. The Soviets stuck with their game plan and scored 2 45 seconds apart late in the second to tie the game. A goal early in the third gave the Soviets the lead. The NHL stars seemed to tire out as the game progressed, sitting back and waiting for things to happen. The Soviets won the game 5-4. Afterwards, Bowman said the Soviets had played a superb game of puck control. Dennis Potvin said, "They beat us at our own game." The final game was an anticlimax. Each team had won a game, and each had dominated the game they'd won. Game 3 would determine the winner of the Challenge Cup. Bowman had started Ken Dryden in net for the first 2 games, but turned to money goalie Jerry Cheevers for the deciding one. Soviet coach Viktor Tikhonov went with Vladimir Mishkin. The game was Mishkin's first against NHL competition. Midway through the second, Mishkin got into a battle with Brian Trottier. Trottier crowded the crease. Mishkin gave him an elbow. Trottier countered by knocking him down. Referee Andy Van Helleman gave the 2 coincidental roughing minors. Valentin Sich was livid. He stormed down to ice level, Ziegler chasing behind him. Sich threatened to pull out of the game for one more such call. Sitch's contention was that Mishkin was within his rights to defend his crease. It must have felt like a betrayal after Dombrowski had called Game 2 evenly and in good faith. At that time of the game, the outcome was still in doubt, but the Soviet defense stifled the NHL All-Stars. In the third, down 2-0, the NHL team pressed the attack. Every time Lafleur touched the puck, the crowd chanted his name, expecting something amazing to happen. It didn't. The Soviets took advantage of NHL defensive lapses and added 4 more for a 6-0 shutout. The Soviets had adjusted to the All-Stars well enough that they outscored them 9-0 in the last game and a half of the series. Soviet captain Boris Mikhailov was named MVP and led the Soviets on a victory lap of MSG to a chorus of boos from what remained of the crowd. The NHL lost more than just the tournament. No one in America outside of MSG seemed to care about the Challenge Cup, and those that did now recognized the Soviets as the supreme hockey world power. The goal of the Challenge Cup was to make it hockey's Super Bowl, or World Series. Instead, the concept landed with a thud. With extremely limited TV reach, the NHL's marketing failure marginalized the game. The NHL considered sending the 1980 Stanley Cup champion to Moscow for a 3-game series in September, but that never materialized. The Challenge Cup format was tried once more in 1987.
The bus doors whooshed open with a hiss and a squeak. An excited kid climbed up the steps with a pad and pen in his hand. He couldn't wipe the grin off his face. The kid's name was Rejean Houle. He wasn't shy. He made a beeline for the biggest superstar of them all, Bobby Hull. He shoved the pen and pad towards Hull's midsection and breathlessly asked for an autograph. Hull took the pad and pen. Now Hull was the one who couldn't wipe the grin off his face. A decade later, Hull is back in Montreal for the Stanley Cup Final. There's a new shadow in town. The number 14 is the same, but the face is different. He can't get rid of this kid. The kid isn't shy. He's all over him like a curtain arrangement. The kid's name is Rejean Houle. Hull could have sworn he looked over his shoulder and saw the kid smiling during their battle. Houle is happy just to be there. For a kid whose father was laid off from the gold mines, it's nice to have a role and a job. That it comes with a personalized Canadiens jersey is icing on the cake, but it's not by accident. It's by design. In 1969, the NHL amateur draft was broken. A system that had been brought in to institute competitive balance between the legacy teams and the expansion clubs had already been co-opted. The 2 best teams in the league got each of the first 4 picks. Montreal used its special territorial exemption to select best friends and line mates Rejean Houle and Marc Tardif with the first 2 picks. Everyone agreed after the draft that it shouldn't be that way, and the league scrapped the exemption after that. There were teams that struggled at the gate. It looked like a few of the new franchises might not make it. And here was Montreal, back in the final again, just 2 years after they'd won 4 of 5. With both kids in the lineup, Houle was making a name for himself, even as the crowd grew impatient to see his name on the score sheet. In junior, he was nearly a goal-a-game scorer, playing on a line with Tardif and Gilbert Perreault for the Montreal Junior Canadiens. He scored 53 goals and 108 points in 54 games. Tardif did better with the big club, outscoring Houle by almost as much as Houle had outscored him in junior. And Perreault? He broke the league scoring record for rookies. Meanwhile, Houle struggled to find his scoring touch. Houle never missed an optional skate. Night in, night out, he would close the building down, taking extra reps, taking extra shots in practice. He was arguably the club's hardest worker, but the goals didn't come. Deployment didn't necessarily facilitate high-scoring numbers. Houle was a left-hand shot playing the off wing. Montreal would move him back to his natural side, only it didn't come naturally anymore. At times they used him at center, Wherever they moved him, whatever role they put him in, he would start well, then slowly regress. The Canadians had drafted him as a trigger man. They were remaking him into a jack of all trades and master of none. Fans and media started calling him Mr. Miss for the number of opportunities he failed to bury. Some missed the point that he had created those opportunities in the first place. But in a city enjoying a 20-year stranglehold on the Stanley Cup, results were all that mattered. Houle had never been a checking forward. He found out what his assignment was going to be on the eve of the 1971 final. The Hull versus Houle battle became a major storyline. It was a size mismatch. Houle weighed 165 pounds, Hull a robust 193. But Houle used his speed to cut off angles and get in Hull's way. Hull would use a well-placed elbow to discourage the effort. Whenever Houle got too close, Hull would simply shove him aside and break away, so Houle learned to stay close to Hull's stick. When Hull got the puck, Houle would move in, hooking and holding. Houle's borderline illegal efforts drew increasing attention. Hull would punish him along the boards, then other Hawks would get in on the act. Houle wasn't discouraged. He was named third star of Game 4. By the end of the series, the pesky Houle had become the Blackhawks' #1 target. While rookie Houle enjoyed a defined full-time role, some of the veterans had been quietly displaced. Chief among them was Henri Richard, who had no goals in the series heading into Game 6. Hull had 3 to go with 5 assists. Richard grew so frustrated with his lack of ice time that he openly called head coach Al McNeil incompetent in the media, the worst coach he had ever played for, and suggested that others in the room felt the same. Hawks superstar Stan Mikita heard the comments and sensed a fractured locker room. He predicted the Canadiens wouldn't win another game. The Canadiens' locker room heard his comments and saw red. Fans in Montreal rang the phones at the Forum off the hook with complaints and death threats. In the deciding game, Richard made up for whatever turmoil he had caused by scoring the tying and winning goals. On the winner, Houle sprung Richard on a partial breakaway. Richard waited out Tony Esposito, found space, and scored from the slot. After the game, Houle, along with fellow youngsters Guy Lapointe and Pierre Bouchard, hoisted McNeil onto their shoulders and carried him on a victory lap around the Madhouse ice surface. By the beginning of 1973, McNeil was already gone, and with him, a clearly defined role for Houle. New Canadiens coach Scotty Bowman didn't quite know how to use him. He was labeled a utility forward. He began considering jumping ship to the new WHA, specifically to the Quebec Nordiques, if they would have him. By playoff time, he was deployed as a shadow once again, this time enshrouding former line-mate Gilbert Perreault. His praises were sung in the media by the same scribes who had questioned his compete level as a rookie. Some called the game he played against Perreault, which eliminated the Sabres, the best of his career. The Canadiens would then go through Philadelphia and Chicago again to capture their 6th Stanley Cup in 9 years. For a team and a city awash in silverware, the fact that Houle had successfully converted his talents from elite junior scorer to elite professional checker was either lost or taken for granted. Houle was key to the club's success. Still, the whispers remained. What happened to the offense, Mr. Miss? Houle was anxious to get back to work on his goal scoring, which had stagnated in a strict checking role. Montreal's depth had likely hurt his offensive production too. On one of the expansion clubs, he might have been a top 6 winger. Jacques Plante, then general manager of the Nordiques, thought so, and gambled $110,000 a year that Houle would revert to his high-scoring ways if they put him back on the off-wing and gave him top 6 deployment. He was right, but that's a different story.
Michel Plasse was always falling down. During one game, head coach Maurice Filion waved Plasse over to the bench. Filion warned him that if he fell down again, he was taking him out of the game. Plasse fell again. and Filion pulled him. Plasse stopped falling after that. At that time, Plasse was a good, average player, but he had been invited to a tryout with Filion and the Drummondville Rangers. He made the team and had a good year in net. He had a good enough year that the Montreal Canadiens drafted him first overall in the 1968 amateur draft. At training camp, Plasse found himself on the bottom of a dog pile. There were 14 goalies at camp. Many of them had all-star potential. Some of them were Hall of Famers. When the season started, he found himself buried behind Ernie Wakely in the AHL, getting into just 7 games all year. He stuck close to fellow francophones Ray Comeau and Pierre Bouchard, spending the year learning English, how to order coffee on the road. In the 7 games he got into, he allowed more than 5 a game on average. He was caught in a vicious cycle of underuse and mistrust. His English, however, improved. The next year, the Canadiens sent him further down the development pipeline, to the Jacksonville Rockets of the third-tier EHL. There, he was the unquestioned starter, appearing in almost every game. The Rockets finished the year having allowed the 3rd most goals in the league. The workload didn't suit him. Before the following season, Plasse was loaned to the St. Louis Blues to serve as backup goalie for their farm team in Kansas City. With limited starts and clear expectations, his game settled. While he only played 16 games in Kansas City, it would be remembered for one night in February. The team played at the American Royal Building, a small venue intended for horse shows and barbecues. Even on game days, the place still smelled of hay and horse manure. One game in that building will always be remembered. Kansas City led Oklahoma City 2-1 late in the 3rd period. Short-handed, the Blues faced a final push as the Blazers pulled their goalie for an extra attacker. With under a minute to play, Oklahoma City defenseman Paul Hurley fanned on a dump-in. The puck slid directly to Plasse. Plasse tried to clear the zone and sent it directly into the open net. Plasse was almost apologetic about it later, insisting that he was only trying to clear the puck out of the zone. Still, he had to concede. It was a hell of a shot. But the play stood as a milestone of the game. By accident, he had become the first professional goalie to score a goal. Because of a blizzard, only a stalwart crowd of 850 saw it. It was an omen of things to come in Kansas City. But more telling than the goal was this. Plasse excelled in a limited role with the Blues affiliate, cutting his goals against average by more than 2 full goals from the previous season. When that season was over, he was returned to Montreal. In Nova Scotia, Plasse formed a tandem with Wayne Thomas. Plasse blossomed in this setting, finding a comfort level and helping the Voyageurs to their 2nd best goals against record in the circuit. But when the playoffs started, Plasse distinguished himself. He became the undisputed star of the playoffs, winning 12 games with 3 shutouts and sporting a goals against average of .125 to help the V's to their first Calder Cup championship. The following season, he was rewarded with his first extended look at the NHL level. As the backup to Ken Dryden, he came into his own. He was still a raw talent. He didn't fall down anymore, but he was weak on long shots and kicked out huge rebounds. He worked to control them, to keep pucks out of the slot. Some thought he was cocky. Others saw a survivor. The Habs won that year. Plasse's name is written on the Stanley Cup. It was his best year as a pro. .912 save percentage, .258 goals against average, .781 winning percentage. And he did it in 17 games. The following year, Dryden took off, escaping out of the goal crease and behind the lawyer's desk. A door of opportunity had creaked open for Plasse. He let it shut in front of him. With Dryden out of the picture, there was no one to recede behind. The tandem he had formed with Thomas that had worked so well in Halifax stopped working at the big time. In a game in late January, He allowed 8 goals to the Boston Bruins and lost the trust of head coach Scotty Bowman. That game followed a 9-goal shellacking at the hands of the Maple Leafs a month earlier. Plasse lost his job to Bunny Larocque. He finished the year with 2 more bad losses in back-to-back starts. It would be the only time in his career that he would spend 2 full years on one team without movement. Montreal left him exposed in the expansion draft. While he had his on-ice struggles, he remained an upbeat presence in the locker room, singing prophetic tales of greener pastures in Kansas City. The prophecies came true, and for the second time in his career, he moved from Montreal to Kansas City, but this time, he was staying in the NHL. The Kansas City Scouts didn't attract many fans, and it wasn't blizzards keeping them away. The team was awful. It was a team composed mostly of leftovers and cast-offs from previous expansion drafts, B prospects, and forgotten veterans. They were awful. One of the lone bright spots, however, was Plasse. But when he asked for a raise over the $40,000 contract he had originally signed in Montreal, he was traded. When he landed in Pittsburgh, he was an instant upgrade to the backup position. He looked good. The Penguins were seen as a young, up-and-coming team, and he fit right in. In the 1975-76 season, he fell into the starter's role. He was winning games and playing well. On trade deadline day, Plasse, Gary Innes, and third-stringer Gord Laxton were hanging out together, as was their style, when the news came down. Innes had been traded for veterans. Plasse faltered. He started 12 of the final 13 games down the stretch. His save percentage plummeted from .898 to .877. His goals against average ballooned by half a goal. The Wags in Pittsburgh accused him of losing confidence and fearing success. The simpler explanation was team chemistry. Innes had been more than competition. He had been balance. Plasse played well in the playoffs, recording a shutout in 3 appearances. The Penguins, however, ran out of offense and exited early. Not long after, Pittsburgh moved him, reacquiring the same goaltender they had traded away to get him. For 3 years, Plasse was the starter in Colorado. The Colorado Rockies had inherited the Scouts' color scheme, roster, and financial problems. Plasse looked good there, the eye of the hurricane. In his second season, he was injured and sent on a conditioning stint to the Philadelphia Firebirds. When he suited up for them, it marked his 12th team in 11 professional seasons. When Don Cherry took over behind the bench, he added volatility to an already unstable situation. Plasse quickly fell out of favor with Cherry and spent most of the year with Fort Worth Texans of the CHL. He had a rough year there behind Bill Olashuk, but when Olashuk stumbled in the playoffs, Plasse came alive. He led the Fort Worth Texans to Game 7 of the Adams Cup Final. They lost to Joey Mullen and the Salt Lake Golden Eagles. During the run, Plasse looked unbeatable at times, but he allowed one too many early in the first period of Game 7. One less than 5 minutes in, held up as the winner. When the season was over, Plasse once again looked for a raise and was once again shown the door. Now a free agent, Plasse was free to pursue a contract anywhere he wanted. However, at 32 years of age, his options were limited. There was one GM who came calling. After a successful junior coaching career, Maurice Filion was now GM of the Quebec Nordiques. He took a chance on Plasse when no one else would. Plasse responded on the ice. When starting goalie Michel Dion began to struggle, Plasse managed to carry the load for a while and provide a steadying presence until Filion was able to trade for Dan Bouchard. It would be the last taste of regular NHL action that Plasse would enjoy. The following season, Plasse struggled out of the gate and was eventually traded to Hartford, where he would play a handful of games for the Whalers' Binghamton affiliate. He retired before the end of the 1981 calendar year. Warning: all these stories are true, even the ones that contradict each other. Neil was a fugitive, a criminal. Just a few hours earlier, he'd been a professional hockey coach. His hands gripped the wheel of the rental car tightly. He checked the rear-view mirror every couple of seconds, looking for red and blue flashing lights. Checking his speed not to draw attention to himself. A sea of red brake lights swam in front of him as he entered the city of Atlanta. He was coming from Birmingham, where a couple hours earlier he'd been coaching the New England Whalers. Things were getting a little too tame on the ice. A hockey game was breaking out. The Alabama hockey fans started shouting, "Bring on the Goons!" There was no team better suited to oblige the taste of the Birmingham crowd than the Minnesota Fighting Saints. Their coach was Harry Neal. But they were gone, and now Neal found himself behind the Whalers bench. Not too many goons there, not like the Fighting Saints. Anyway, it was Thanksgiving in Birmingham, and the fans had been verbally abusing the Whalers and their coach all night. When they started throwing things, it crossed the line. Neal grabbed a stick off the rack and started swinging it at his abusers. He got in a good whack or two, but accidentally hit a woman. The police wanted to have a little chat with Neal after the incident. Next thing you know, he's rushing out the locker room and hailing a taxi to the rental car place, and, well, let's just say the woman eventually settled out of court. It was hard for someone who had survived the Fighting Saints to understand what was the big deal. Things got out of hand all the time back in St. Paul. Shaky was the best player for the Fighting Saints. On the ice, puck on his stick, he was a poem told in chopping strides. End-to-end rushes, dancing around defenders, 100 miles an hour. Then, boom, clapper from the face-off circle, glove side and in. The mesh ripples. 3,000 people lose their minds. Shaky was going to be a big star. Back in Toronto, they'd groomed him to be the replacement for Frank Mahovlich, who didn't really like the spotlight. It didn't quite work out that way, but don't tell Shaky that. Loose puck through the neutral zone, open ice, nobody between Shaky and the goalie. He's got a head of steam, legs chopping, dancing again. This is what he lives for. He touches the puck. The whistle blows. Shaky looks over his shoulder. His teammate, Gord Gallant, is drifting to the penalty box. Shaky slaps his stick on the ice, button hooks towards the box, starts yelling. The whole building can hear him, every word, cussing out his own teammate. When the penalty's over, Gallant skates back to the bench and beats hell out of Shaky in front of everyone. The ref wants to call a penalty on the Fighting Saints for the fight. Neal said, "There's no rule against two teammates fighting." The ref thinks about it for a minute and says, "Well, you got a point there." Shaky got treated differently. Everyone knew it. It drove some guys nuts. Others just shrugged. That was the deal. He'd be all in some game days, just a rumor with a shadow on others. If you weren't one of the first guys at the bank to cash your check, forget it. Veterans showed up late for practices on payday. Shaky wouldn't even park with the other players. Every now and then, Neal would pick him up personally. No woodshed speeches, no paperwork, just a drive and a conversation. Most nights it didn't change much, but every once in a while it worked. And on those nights, Shaky could do it all. Of course, some nights he did too much. One night, they said, he fought his own teammate on the ice. Like this sort of thing happened all the time. One other night, rumor has it, things weren't going his way, so he up and skates off the ice in the middle of the period, right past the locker room, and just kept going. They found him after the game at the bar, still in his skates and uniform. Things got out of hand sometimes in St. Paul. But that's not how it happened. It went like this. It actually happened in South Chicago. The whistle blew, and Neal's reaction was immediate. Protest, hot under the collar. 1 foot up on the top of the boards, leaning in and really giving it to the refs. Then the fans got on him. The banging on the glass, the laughter, the smart comments. Banging becomes pushing. Pushing gets too close for comfort. So Neil pushes back. Now more fans pile in, pushing against the glass. Now a couple Saints players are pushing back with Neil. Before you know it, it's a seesaw battle. Someone grabs a stick and starts swatting it over the top of the glass. Then another stick. And another. In one regular old game in San Diego, this guy was chirping Shaky all night. Now you've got to remember, in San Diego, they've got chicken wire instead of plexiglass along the end boards. There's a scrum in the corner and the guy gets a little too close. He's got his face pressed right up against the chicken wire, talking smack. Shaky lets him have it. Bonk, with the butt end of the stick. The guy got back up with a red rectangle stamped across his forehead. The case got dismissed. The judge agreed that guy was crazy. Some of the veteran players knew to keep the car running on payday. The boss would sign the check, hand it over with a solemn look. Guys had about 20 minutes tops to get to the bank, and if there was a lineup when you got there, look out. On road trips, some of the older guys, the staff and veterans, would peel into a dark corner and chip in for lunch to feed the guys who hadn't got paid yet. They'd be out there promoting scrimmages, radio spots, meet and greets. Tickets sold well, but never as many as they needed. Then the bank would call. So you dig in and shake a few more hands before the next game. Just keep kicking that can down the road. 20 minutes west, the North Stars were at the peak of their popularity. Shaky could light them up. Cheech could hang with their snipers. Other than that, the Fighting Saints had what the North Stars didn't, a little muscle in the lineup. Every year, Glenn Sonmore would challenge the North Stars to an all-Twin Cities exhibition match. And every year, the North Stars would glance down and politely decline. They were always a little more Adena, while the Fighting Saints were always a little more East St. Paul. What actually happened was the coach was walking to the players' bench with Goldie. There was a police barricade holding back the crowd. Those fans in Houston were rowdy. One guy kind of breaks the cordon and gets close enough for Goldie to get a mitt on him. Whack! The guy's out cold. The whole place loses it. The mob pushes in, the cops are pushing back. Coach and Goldie are ducking, dodging, and swinging wildly as they get surrounded. Finally, the cops broke everything up and escorted them to the Saints bench. Goldie smirked when he looked over his shoulder and saw the police trying to revive the guy so they could arrest him. Or was it that time in Cleveland where a fan dumped beer on Neil? They always did that in Cleveland. Most guys would just smart off and tell the fans to pick a better brand, but not Neil. He charged into the stands and went right after the guy. Some of the players went in there with him too. But that one fan never charged Bill Butters for biting him on the hand. And the sticks? Pye McKenzie skating by the Saints bench. He looks right at Harry Neal and makes a rude comment. Just spits it out with venom. Without hesitating, Neil calmly turned around, grabbed a stick, and started swinging it in Pye's face. McKenzie didn't back down either. He went right over to Neil and they started fighting. Then the benches cleared. 8,000 people went crazy. There were a few times when things got out of hand in St. Paul. He let the phone ring. Almost definitely going to be someone who wanted money anyway. He cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. He decided then and there he was going to the airport. The flight was booked for the next game. There was somebody, a truck driver apparently, who was going to buy the team. He'd at least agreed to support everybody through the weekend. It was a sorry turnout at the airport. Just a handful of players. Shaky and Cheech were there, and Harry Neal. They were expecting more. Not enough to make a team and carry on. Guess the rest just gave up on believing. Or maybe they just ran out of money. Those who did show up voted right there on the spot to fold the team. That way, everybody could sign somewhere else and pick up a couple paychecks before the season ended. Rest of the guys found out in the newspapers the next day, if they weren't out of town by then already. When things were going good, Maple Leaf Gardens was like the church of hockey. The crowd was silent, reverent, observant. If you could find tickets, you'd dress your family in their Sunday best and expect a good effort. Frank Mahovlich was the kind of player who liked to get out on the ice and get a feel for how things were going. He would tinker. He would try things. The Maple Leafs crowd paid to see a finished product, not a work in progress. When things weren't going, they'd get on a player. He noticed. Before long, even when things were going good, they'd get on him. When Mahovlich tinkered, the crowd saw hesitation. When he was tired at the end of a shift, they saw laziness. He'd score one goal, they'd question the two that didn't go in. He was quiet in the locker room. The other guys didn't get a chance to know him. He'd answer reporters' questions through gritted teeth. Sometimes, he just wanted to be by himself for a while. On 2 separate occasions, he took a few weeks off during the season to see a psychiatrist. The crowd noticed. Punch Imlich had tried everything. He tried coddling the guy, he tried talking to him quietly, he tried yelling at him. A kick in the pants just made him sit down. Finally, he traded him to Detroit. In Detroit, Gordy was the guy, no question. Mahovlich didn't have to live up to everybody else's expectations. In Toronto, they compared him to Hull and Beliveau and Gordy. Then they'd look at the stat sheet and ask what happened. They missed the big picture. The Big M had finished his time in Toronto 11th on the all-time goals list, wearing 4 Stanley Cup rings. When the conquistadors landed in America, their horses had been cooped up on the ships for months. When they made landfall, the horses ran around like crazy, leaping and cavorting. Guys who knew him in Toronto hardly recognized Mahovlich in Detroit. There's Frank. He's laughing and smiling. He's joking around. He's talking philosophically. Who was this guy? Where'd he been all those years? Detroit was a great place to play, but the Red Wings were a team on the downswing. He followed his brother to Montreal in 1971. There, he was given respect and a defined role. Sam Pollock was criticized by the Canadian media at the time for trading 3 good young players for a 33-year-old. The results spoke for themselves. The big Mahovlich boys killed penalties together. Frank set a playoff scoring record that year and a surprise Stanley Cup victory. Nobody in Montreal complained when Mickey Redmond hit 50 goals back-to-back times in Detroit. Frank, now fully unlocked, had a career year in 1972 with 96 points. The Summit Series happened. Another cup followed. He became just the 5th man to 500 NHL goals. When his contract was up, Pollock offered $250,000 per year to extend. There was another expansion draft that summer. Mahovlich advised Pollock to expose him. Mahovlich was planning on going back to Toronto. John Bassett had a way of making everything exciting. Bassett had been a multi-sport star, a reporter, and now owned the Toronto Toros of the WHA. He was also owner of the Memphis Southmen of the short-lived WFL. When Elvis Presley met him, he asked for Bassett's autograph. Mahovlich provided an autograph for Bassett when he signed with the WHA Toros. The press was confused. Why return to the scene of years of torment? Mahovlich said it was about security for his family, even though Pollock had offered more money. Now with the other big league Toronto team, he was back in Maple Leaf Gardens. Harold Ballard made the Toros play in the locker room reserved for visitors to the junior Marlies. He took the padding off the benches in the locker room for WHA games. But nobody got on his case with the Toros. Not the fans, not the media. He produced, he stayed quiet. Other guys stepped into the spotlight. They had Nedomansky, the Czech Gordie Howe, Henderson, Canada's hero. He gave everybody a Bible at the Christmas party. And then there was Gilles Gratton. That guy was a one-man circus. And then there was the underage kid that led the team in scoring. There was enough going on with the club that Mahovlich didn't have to be the center of attention. His game aged gracefully. Eventually, the team moved to the Deep South, but kept their logo and were now the Birmingham Bulls. Mahovlich went from the center of the hockey universe to virtual invisibility in Alabama. The organist would play Dixie between whistles. He played well. Eventually, in order to draw crowds, the Bulls packed the roster full of goons. Frank Beaton and the Hanson brothers weren't exactly Gordian fats, but he still managed 38 points. 38 points with 2 goons is pretty good for a 40-year-old, even in a second-rate league. One day, the contract ran out. He quietly packed his bags and just didn't return. All this time, they'd never forgotten him in the show. Even then, in the fall of 1978, he was still getting offers for Montreal and Pittsburgh. He said no. His back was sore. He had a travel agency business to get back home anyway. A year later, it was good to feel leg muscles burning again. The crack of sticks, the spray of the ice. He had followed his brother once more, this time back to Detroit. This time on a tryout. He was 41 years old. As a young man, he figured he'd play until age 34 or so. That sounded like a good, long career at the time. Of course, there was no WHA back then, just like there wasn't one in September 1979. He played out the preseason, but never earned the spotlight again. When the exhibition schedule was completed, he told Wings coach Bobby Crom he didn't think he could hack it anymore, and walked away again. Crom was relieved that he didn't have to tell him. He patted Mahovlich on the shoulder and told him he was a hell of a player.